At my daughter's get-together, when I leaned in to hug my son-in-law, the man she called her world, he stepped back. The marble floors beneath my feet felt like ice, cold and unforgiving, just like the look in his eyes. I'd driven 40 minutes through traffic, clutching a gift I'd wrapped myself in silver paper that now seemed to mock me with its cheerful shine. "I'd rather kiss my dog than hug you," he said. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt my chest constrict, my breath catch somewhere between my throat and my heart. But it wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Loud enough for everyone to hear. Deliberate. Performative. Like he'd been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it. Laughter erupted around me. Crystal glasses clinked in approval. Someone even whistled, actually whistled, like they were applauding a particularly clever performance. These were people I'd known for years, people who'd eaten at my table when my daughter first brought Ethan home. Now they were spectators to my humiliation, and they were enjoying the show. My hands trembled around the gift I'd wrapped myself, silver paper shaking like my fingers. Inside that box was my late husband's heirloom watch, a piece that had been in our family for 3 generations. I'd polished it that morning, thinking about how my husband would have wanted his son-in-law to have something meaningful, something that connected our families. How foolish I'd been. Then louder, ensuring every person in that room could hear, he added, "You're not even fit to be my mother-in-law. Stay away from me." The laughter rolled through that marble-floored penthouse like thunder I wasn't meant to survive. It echoed off those pristine walls, bounced off the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city lights, and settled into my bones like poison. I could feel it burning through me, the shame, the shock, the absolute disbelief that this was happening to me, in front of all these people. But here's what Ethan didn't know, what none of them knew as they laughed and clinked their glasses and whispered among themselves about the pathetic old woman who couldn't take a joke. I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because I'd already found what he'd been hiding. You see, 3 weeks earlier, I'd been helping my daughter organize her home office. She'd asked me to file some papers while she ran errands, trusting me as daughters trust their mothers. And there, mixed in with utility bills and grocery receipts, I found bank statements that didn't belong to my daughter. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Payments to charities that existed only on paper. A paper trail of fraud so elaborate, so extensive, that it took my breath away. I'd spent 2 decades as an accountant before my husband's illness forced me to care for him full-time. Numbers don't lie, even when the men behind them do. And Ethan's numbers told a story of systematic theft, of investors deceived, of trust funds raided, of a house of cards built on other people's money and dreams. So as that laughter echoed around me, as faces I'd once considered friendly twisted into masks of cruel amusement, I held on to that secret knowledge like a lifeline. Before the night was over, his empire would crumble beneath the same chandeliers that lit my humiliation. But let me tell you how we got here, because this story didn't start with that moment of public cruelty. It started years earlier, in the quiet spaces where disrespect grows like mold in darkness, spreading until it consumes everything decent in its path. I became a widow at 52. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in March, after fighting cancer for 18 months, with the kind of dignity that makes you proud and heartbroken all at once. The morning after his funeral, I woke up in our empty house and realized I had a choice: disappear into grief or build something beautiful from what remained. I chose to build. I threw myself into raising our daughter Sarah with the fierce love of a woman who knew what loss meant. Every piano lesson, every soccer game, every late night helping with homework, I was there. Not because I was trying to be both mother and father, but because I was determined to be the best version of myself for the daughter who'd already lost too much. Sarah grew up strong and kind and brilliant, everything Robert and I had hoped for. She got into law school, graduated summa cum laude, landed a position at a prestigious firm. I was proud of her in that bone-deep way that parents understand, not just proud of her achievements, but proud of who she'd become. and then she met Ethan. At first, I was grateful. My daughter, who'd watched her father waste away and had sworn off serious relationships, was finally letting someone in. Ethan seemed perfect on paper, Harvard MBA, successful investment firm, the kind of presence that commanded rooms. He was generous with expensive gifts, attentive in that sweeping, romantic way that makes women feel chosen. He proposed after 8 months with a ring that cost more than my car. The wedding was a spectacle of white roses and string quartets, held at a country club where the membership fees could have funded a small college. I stood in the back during the ceremony, watching my daughter glow with happiness, and felt something I thought was contentment. But contentment, I learned, was just the calm before the erosion began. It started small, as these things always do. Ethan would redirect conversations when I mentioned Robert, changing the subject with the smooth efficiency of a man accustomed to controlling narratives. "Let's focus on the future," he'd say with that practiced smile. "Sarah deserves to look forward, not backward." At first, I thought he was protecting her. Grief, after all, isn't always welcome at dinner parties and family gatherings. But then I realized he wasn't protecting Sarah from painful memories. He was erasing them. And in erasing Robert, he was erasing me. The suggestions about my appearance came next. Nothing overt, nothing you could call cruel outright. Just gentle observations that maybe I'd be more comfortable in something more contemporary when we went out to dinner. That perhaps I should consider updating my hairstyle for Sarah's work functions. That my stories about the old neighborhood might not be as interesting to their friends as I thought. Each suggestion was wrapped in concern, delivered with that patronizing tone that makes you question your own judgment. Was I really holding my daughter back with my outdated clothes and embarrassing anecdotes? Was I the problem in this perfect life he was trying to build? The most insidious part was how he controlled what I could say about Robert. During family dinners, if I mentioned something my husband had said or done, Ethan would clear his throat and change the subject. If I tried to share a memory that included Robert, he'd interrupt with some urgent business matter or architectural detail about whatever restaurant we were in. "We need to help Sarah move forward," he told me once, cornering me in the kitchen during a holiday gathering. Constantly bringing up her father's death isn't healthy for anyone. But I wasn't constantly bringing up Robert's death. I was trying to keep his life alive, to ensure that the man who'd shaped our daughter into the incredible woman she'd become wasn't simply forgotten because acknowledging him was inconvenient for Ethan's narrative. You see, Ethan wanted a perfect family portrait, and he needed to erase the woman who'd made it possible to create the illusion that he was the architect of Sarah's success. In his version of their story, he was the prince who'd rescued a beautiful but damaged woman from a life of hardship and grief. There was no room in that fairy tale for a mother who'd raised a confident, accomplished daughter through 20 years of love and sacrifice. The worst part wasn't what he did to me. The worst part was watching my daughter slowly disappear into his version of perfection. Sarah, who'd once called me every day, started calling once a week, then once a month. Sarah, who'd inherited her father's sense of justice and her mother's backbone, began apologizing for things that didn't require apologies, for my clothes, my opinions, my very existence in their carefully curated life. I watched my brilliant daughter shrink herself to fit into the narrow space Ethan had carved out for her, and I felt a rage so deep it scared me. This wasn't love. This was ownership. And somehow, he'd convinced her that being owned was the same thing as being cherished. But I kept quiet. I smiled at the right moments, laughed at his jokes that weren't funny, and wore the clothes that made him comfortable. I told myself I was preserving my relationship with my daughter, that confrontation would only drive her further away. What I was really doing was enabling my own erasure. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, thick and expensive like everything in Ethan's world. "You're cordially invited to celebrate the launch of Meridian Capital's latest venture," it read in elegant script. Below that, in smaller text, "an evening of excellence and innovation." Sarah called the day after I received it, her voice bright with the forced enthusiasm I'd learned to recognize. "Mom, you got the invitation, right? Ethan's throwing this amazing party for his new fund. All the biggest investors in the city will be there." I could hear the subtext in her excitement. This matters to him, which means it has to matter to you too. This party wasn't just a celebration. It was another performance in the theater of Ethan's success, and I was expected to play my role as the grateful mother-in-law who knew her place. "Of course I'll be there," I told her, already dreading it. These events were always the same, rooms full of people who spoke in calculated whispers about money and influence, while servers in black uniforms offered champagne and tiny appetizers that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. But this time, I decided, would be different. If I was going to attend another evening of being politely ignored or subtly dismissed, I was going to bring something meaningful with me. I spent the entire next day preparing Robert's heirloom watch. It had been his grandfather's, then his father's, then a beautiful Omega Seamaster from 1952 with a leather band that had been replaced twice, but somehow still carried the essence of the hands that had worn it. Robert had always said it would go to our son-in-law someday, when Sarah found someone worthy of joining our family. I cleaned every surface until the face gleamed, polished the band until it was supple and rich again. I found the original certificate of authenticity, the warranty papers that Robert's father had saved, even a photograph of Robert's grandfather wearing it on his wedding day. I arranged everything in a wooden presentation box lined with navy velvet. This wasn't just a gift. This was an offering, my attempt to bridge the gap between the man I'd loved and the man my daughter had chosen. Maybe if Ethan understood the weight of what I was giving him, the history and love it represented, he'd finally see me as something more than an inconvenience to be managed. 3 days before the party, Sarah called again. Her voice was different this time, tighter, more careful. "Mom, about Saturday night. Ethan's really stressed about this event. It's make or break for the new fund, and there will be some very important people there." "I understand," I said, though I was beginning to understand more than she realized. I need you to promise me you'll be careful. About what you say, I mean. Some of these investors are very traditional, very conservative. They have certain expectations about." She trailed off, but I knew what she couldn't bring herself to say. They have certain expectations about how women like me should behave. Seen but not heard. Present but not participatory. Grateful but not demanding. "I'll behave," I said, hating myself for the promise even as I made it. "Thank you," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too," I replied, but the words felt hollow. Love shouldn't require this much management, this much careful navigation around one person's ego. The morning of the party, I went through my ritual of respectability. I chose a navy dress that was elegant without being attention-seeking, pearls that had been my mother's but weren't ostentatious enough to offend. I applied my makeup with the precision of a woman preparing for battle, each stroke of lipstick a small act of defiance against the voices telling me I didn't belong. My hands were trembling as I drove through the city toward Ethan's penthouse. Not from fear exactly, but from something deeper. The terrible anticipation of walking willingly into a space where I wasn't wanted, where my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like ascending toward my own execution. Each floor that passed brought me closer to a world where I was fundamentally unwelcome, where my very existence challenged the narrative Ethan had constructed about his perfect life. The doors opened onto a scene of glittering perfection. The penthouse was transformed into something from a magazine. Flowers that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, lighting that made everyone look like they were posing for portraits, servers moving through the crowd with military precision. I could see Ethan across the room, holding court near the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city lights. He looked every inch the successful financier, perfectly tailored suit, confident posture, that smile that could charm investors out of their life savings. Which, I was beginning to understand, might not be entirely metaphorical. Sarah appeared at my side, beautiful in a way that made my heart ache. She looked so much like her father when he was young, the same intelligent eyes, the same thoughtful expression. But there was something dimmed in her now, a light that had been carefully modulated to match Ethan's expectations. "You look beautiful, honey," I told her, meaning it. "Thank you. You too, Mom." She glanced around nervously. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people." The next hour passed in a blur of forced conversations and careful smiles. I met investors who spoke about market opportunities and portfolio optimization, while their wives discussed charity galas and vacation homes. Everyone was perfectly polite, perfectly pleasant, and perfectly clear that I was peripheral to their world. I found myself studying the room, cataloging details that might be important later. The way certain people gravitated toward Ethan while others maintained careful distance. The nervous energy that seemed to shimmer beneath the polished surface. The conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached, then resumed in different directions. Something was wrong here. I'd spent enough years around Robert's business associates to recognize the signs of a community under stress. This wasn't just a celebration, it was a performance designed to convince these people that everything was stable, profitable, secure. But I could see the cracks. In the forced laughter that lasted a beat too long. In the way some guests checked their phones with the urgency of people expecting bad news. In the almost desperate quality of Ethan's charm as he worked the room. By 9 o'clock, I knew I needed to give him the watch and escape. I retrieved the presentation box from the coat check and made my way across the room, weaving between clusters of conversations about things I wasn't supposed to understand. Ethan was standing with a group of older men, gesturing expansively as he told some story about market timing and risk assessment. I waited at the edge of their circle, holding the box against my chest like armor. "Ethan," I said when there was a pause in the conversation, "could I speak with you for a moment?" He turned toward me with that practiced smile, but I caught something else in his expression, irritation, quickly masked. "Of course, Margaret." "Gentlemen, excuse me for just a moment." I followed him a few steps away from the group, my heart pounding. This was my chance to bridge the gap, to offer something that might finally earn his respect. "I wanted to give you something," I said, extending the box toward him. It was Robert's father's and his grandfather's before that. Robert always said it should go to our son-in-law when Sarah found the right person. Ethan looked at the box like I was offering him a live snake. "That's very thoughtful, Margaret. But I really can't accept something so valuable." "Please," I said, stepping closer. "It would mean so much to me. To Robert's memory." That's when I leaned in to hug him, hoping to seal this moment of connection, to finally break through the wall he'd built between us. And that's when he stepped back. The words echoed in my head long after he'd said them. "I'd rather kiss my dog than hug you." Each syllable burned into my memory with perfect clarity. The way his voice carried across the room. The immediate response from his audience. The sound of my own dignity shattering against marble floors. But as the laughter swirled around me and the faces blurred into a sea of cruel amusement, something cold and sharp crystallized in my chest. Not just rage, though God knows there was plenty of that. This was something more focused, more purposeful. This was the moment when 30 years of quiet endurance transformed into something Ethan had never encountered before, a woman with nothing left to lose. You see, humiliation has a strange effect on some people. It can crush you into silence, make you small and apologetic and grateful for whatever scraps of respect people are willing to throw your way. Or it can burn away everything unnecessary, all the politeness, all the careful navigation around other people's comfort, all the lies you tell yourself about why you should keep quiet. Standing in that room full of people who thought my pain was entertainment, I felt every one of those careful constraints incinerate. What was left was 47 years of loving a man who'd never once made me question my worth, 20 years of raising a daughter who deserved better than what she'd settled for, and 3 weeks of carrying the knowledge that could destroy the man who'd just tried to destroy me. I looked around that room, really looked, and saw them clearly for the first time. These weren't titans of industry. They were marks in an elaborate con game, and they had no idea how completely they'd been played. The nervous energy I'd sensed earlier suddenly made perfect sense. Some of them were beginning to suspect that their golden boy wasn't quite as golden as advertised. My smile felt foreign on my face, like I was wearing someone else's expression. But it was the right expression for what came next. "You're absolutely right, Ethan," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sudden hush that had fallen over our corner of the room. "I'm not fit to be your mother-in-law." The box with Robert's watch felt weightless in my hands now. All that history, all that love, wasted on someone who couldn't recognize value when it was offered freely. "Because a woman with standards," I continued, pulling my phone from my evening clutch, "wouldn't cover for your crimes." The word crimes hit the room like a physical force. Conversations didn't just pause, they died mid-sentence. I could see people turning toward us, drawn by the same instinct that makes crowds gather around accidents. Ethan's face went through a series of expressions so quickly I almost missed them. Confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been fear. "Margaret, what are you?" "The Cayman Islands account," I said, reading from the screenshot on my phone. "Account number 847-923-1156. 17 transfers in the past 6 months, totaling $2.3 million from the Meridian Charitable Foundation." The silence was so complete I could hear the air conditioning system humming overhead. Every face in that room was turned toward us now, and I could see the exact moment when several investors recognized those numbers. "That's the foundation for underprivileged children, isn't it?" I asked, my voice dripping with false curiosity. "Funny how those children seem to live in tax haven countries." Ethan's face had gone completely pale. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Account number 398-467-2801, I continued, scrolling to the next screenshot. "Monthly payments of $15,000 to someone named Victoria Chen." "Is that a business expense, Ethan? Or is that what you call an investment in your marriage?" I heard someone gasp. A glass hit the floor somewhere behind me, crystal shattering against marble. But I wasn't done. 3 weeks of careful investigation had given me enough ammunition to destroy him twice over. "And my personal favorite," I said, finding the screenshot that had made my blood run cold when I first saw it. "The retirement accounts for Meridian Capital employees. Apparently, they've been temporarily relocated to cover some bad investments. I'm sure your employees will be thrilled to learn that their pension funds are backing your gambling habit." The room erupted. Not in laughter this time, but in the kind of chaos that happens when people realize they've been watching their money disappear into the pockets of a con man. Voices rose in alarm, in anger, in the terrible recognition of betrayal. I watched Ethan's empire begin to crumble in real time. Investors pulling out phones, calling lawyers, calling accountants, calling anyone who might be able to tell them how much they'd lost to this man's greed. Partners backing away from him like he was radioactive. Associates suddenly remembering urgent appointments elsewhere. But the most devastating part was watching my daughter's face. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, her perfect party dress suddenly looking like a costume for a play she'd never auditioned for. The color had drained from her cheeks, and her eyes held the terrible clarity of someone seeing their life from the outside for the first time. "Mom," she whispered, barely audible above the noise. "How did you?" "I found your filing cabinet 3 weeks ago," I said gently. "When you asked me to help organize your office, remember? And I've spent every day since then documenting what he's been doing with other people's money." Ethan grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "You have no idea what you've just done," he snarled, all pretense of charm finally stripped away. "You've destroyed everything." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. For the first time in years, I felt completely, perfectly calm. "Yes," I said. "I have." And that's when I walked away. The elevator ride down from that penthouse felt like descending from a nightmare back into reality. My phone had started buzzing before the doors even closed. Calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the story, messages from lawyers offering their services, texts from people I hadn't heard from in years who'd seen the early news reports. By the time I reached the parking garage, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys into the ignition. Not from fear or regret, but from the sheer physical exhaustion of carrying that much rage for so long and finally releasing it into the world. I drove home through empty streets, past office buildings where the lights were already dimming and restaurants where normal people were having normal evenings that didn't involve destroying their sons-in-law's criminal enterprises. My house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it 3 hours earlier, but I felt like I was returning from a journey that had lasted years. The first news alert hit my phone at 11:47 p.m., local investment firm under investigation following charity fraud allegations. By midnight, it was trending on social media. By 1 a.m., 3 major news outlets had picked up the story. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Robert's old chair, watching my phone light up with notification after notification. Part of me wanted to turn it off, to retreat into the quiet safety of my own home and pretend the outside world didn't exist. But another part of me, the part that had been silent for too long, needed to see this through. The calls started at 6 a.m. First the reporters, then the FBI, then lawyers representing various investors who wanted to know what else I might have discovered. By noon, I'd given 3 interviews, turned over copies of all the documents I'd found, and been assured by federal investigators that Ethan's assets would be frozen within hours. Sarah called at 2 p.m. I almost didn't answer. I wasn't ready for her anger, her accusations, her defense of the man who'd just lost her everything they'd built together. But I couldn't ignore my daughter, even if she was calling to tell me she never wanted to see me again. Mom? Her voice was small, fragile in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child. I'm here, sweetheart. Can I come over? I need to talk to you. She arrived an hour later, still wearing the same dress from the party, but looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. Her makeup was gone, her hair disheveled, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone whose entire world had just been revealed as an illusion. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd taught her to make cookies, where we'd done homework together, where we'd planned her wedding to a man we thought would love and protect her. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. How long have you known? She finally asked. 3 weeks. Since the day you asked me to file your papers. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at my daughter, this brilliant, accomplished woman who'd somehow convinced herself that love meant accepting disrespect, and felt my heart break all over again. Would you have believed me? She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. No, she whispered. I wouldn't have. That's when she told me everything. About the months of subtle control that had escalated into outright manipulation. About the friends she'd lost because Ethan found them unsuitable. About the job opportunities she'd turned down because they would have made her more successful than him. About the slow, systematic erosion of everything that had made her herself. He said he was protecting me, she sobbed. He said you were holding me back, that I needed to focus on our future instead of dwelling on the past. And I believed him because I wanted to believe that someone could love me enough to take care of everything. I held my daughter while she cried, and I felt something shift between us, not forgiveness, exactly, because forgiveness implies fault, and Sarah had been as much a victim in this as anyone. But understanding. Recognition. The beginning of truth. I'm so sorry, Mom, she said against my shoulder. I'm sorry I let him treat you that way. I'm sorry I treated you that way. You were in love, I said, stroking her hair the way I had when she was small and the world had hurt her. Love makes us stupid sometimes. It makes us believe things that we know deep down aren't true. How did you know? She asked. How did you know to look for evidence? I pulled back so I could see her face. Because men like Ethan don't just steal money, sweetheart. They steal everything: dignity, autonomy, the right to exist without constantly measuring yourself against their expectations. And I've lived long enough to know that someone who steals those things will steal anything. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings and media attention that I'd never wanted but couldn't avoid. Every morning brought new revelations about the extent of Ethan's fraud, and every evening brought new victims coming forward with their stories. The Meridian Charitable Foundation, it turned out, had been nothing more than an elaborate money laundering operation. The underprivileged children it claimed to serve existed only in carefully crafted reports designed to convince donors they were making a difference. Every dollar that had been donated with the intention of helping vulnerable kids had instead funded Ethan's lifestyle and his growing list of financial obligations. The retirement accounts were even worse. 53 employees had been faithfully contributing to pension funds that Ethan had been systematically draining to cover his bad investments. Men and women who'd worked their entire careers expecting to retire with dignity found out their futures had been gambled away by someone they'd trusted. And then there was Victoria Chin. Victoria turned out to be a 24-year-old graduate student who'd thought she was in a relationship with a successful, unmarried businessman named Eric Thompson. She had no idea that Eric was actually Ethan Meridian, that he had a wife, or that the money he was spending on their relationship had been stolen from charitable donations. When Victoria learned the truth, she called me. "I don't know why I'm calling you," she said, her voice shaking. I saw your interview on the news, and I wanted to say thank you." "You don't need to thank me," I told her. "I'm sorry you got caught up in his lies." "He told me his family didn't understand him," she said. "He made me feel like we were star-crossed lovers or something, like we were fighting against a world that wanted to keep us apart. I had no idea I was just another way for him to spend other people's money." That conversation stayed with me for days. Victoria wasn't a villain. She was another victim, manipulated and used just like everyone else in Ethan's orbit. And she was brave enough to testify, to help prosecutors build their case against the man who'd stolen her authenticity along with everything else. The investigation expanded beyond Ethan to include several of his business partners who'd been complicit in various schemes. Bank accounts were frozen, assets were seized, and what had once been presented as a thriving investment empire was revealed to be nothing more than an elaborate Ponzi scheme propped up by stolen funds and false promises. Sarah threw herself into helping the prosecutors, providing access to documents and financial records that Ethan had hidden in their shared accounts. She worked with the same fierce determination she'd once applied to her legal career, driven by a need to make amends for the years she'd spent as an unwitting accomplice to his crimes. "I want to fix this," she told me one evening as we went through boxes of financial records in her kitchen. "I want to help these people get their money back." "You can't fix everything, sweetheart," I said gently. "Some of this damage is permanent." "But I can try," she said, and I heard echoes of the girl who'd once wanted to save every stray animal in the neighborhood, who'd believed that justice was possible if you just worked hard enough. The night before Ethan's arraignment, Sarah and I sat in my garden, watching the sun set behind the trees Robert had planted 20 years ago. The peace of that moment felt surreal after weeks of chaos and publicity. "Do you think Dad would be proud of what I did?" I asked. Sarah looked at me with surprise. "Mom, of course he would. You stopped a criminal. You saved people's retirement funds. You probably prevented him from stealing millions more. But I destroyed your marriage in the process." "You saved me from my marriage," she corrected. "There's a difference." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening birds and the distant sound of children playing in neighboring yards. Normal sounds from a normal world that we were slowly finding our way back to. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we rebuild," I said. "You figure out who you are when you're not trying to be perfect for someone else. And I figure out who I am when I'm not apologizing for existing." "I like the sound of that," she said. The courtroom was packed the day Ethan was sentenced. I sat in the front row, flanked by Sarah on one side and Victoria Chen on the other. Behind us, the gallery was filled with investors who'd lost their savings, employees who'd lost their pensions, and families who'd donated to a charity that existed only to fund one man's greed. Ethan looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his clothes. Gone was the commanding presence that had once filled rooms, replaced by something shrunken and desperate. He kept glancing around the courtroom as if looking for someone who might still believe in his innocence, but those days were over. The prosecutor had done her homework. The case was airtight, built on the foundation of documents I'd provided and strengthened by testimony from dozens of victims. There was no possibility of acquittal, no chance of the kind of legal maneuvering that might have saved him in another context. When it came time for victim impact statements, I walked to the podium with hands that weren't shaking for the first time in months. I looked out at the courtroom, at the faces of people whose lives had been damaged by one man's arrogance and greed, and I felt the weight of responsibility that comes with speaking truth to power. Your Honor, I began. Ethan Meridian didn't just steal money. He stole my daughter's peace of mind. He stole my reputation and my place in my own family. He stole the retirement dreams of 53 hardworking employees. He stole donations meant to help vulnerable children. But most importantly, he stole something intangible but essential. He stole trust. I paused, looking directly at Ethan for the first time since the night of the party. He was staring at his hands, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. Trust, I continued, is the foundation of every relationship, every business deal, every charitable donation. It's what allows parents to send their children to school believing they'll be safe. It's what allows workers to contribute to pension funds believing their futures are secure. It's what allows donors to give money believing it will help people who need it. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath. Ethan Meridian systematically destroyed that trust. He took the faith that people placed in him, and he weaponized it for personal gain. He didn't just commit financial crimes, he committed crimes against the very idea that we can believe in each other, that we can build something together based on mutual respect and shared values. I could see some of the victims nodding, recognizing their own experiences in my words. The money can be repaid, eventually. The accounts can be rebuilt. But the trust he destroyed, the faith he shattered, that will take generations to repair. And that's why I hope this court will impose a sentence that reflects not just the financial damage he caused, but the human damage as well. I looked at Sarah, who was crying quietly in the front row, and then back at the judge. Thank you, Your Honor. As I walked back to my seat, I heard something I hadn't expected, applause. Quiet at first, then building as more people joined in. The judge had to call for order, but the message was clear. These people, these victims, felt heard. Ethan's lawyer made a perfunctory plea for leniency, citing his client's previously clean record and his potential for rehabilitation. But the damage was too extensive, the betrayal too complete. When the judge announced the sentence, 15 years in federal prison, full restitution to victims, and forfeiture of all assets, there was a collective sigh of relief that seemed to fill the entire courtroom. As the bailiffs led Ethan away, he finally looked at me. There was no arrogance left in his expression, no superiority or condescension. Just the hollow look of a man who'd finally run out of other people to blame for his choices. Sarah whispered, "You saved me, Mom." And for the first time in years, I believed her. 1 year later, I'm standing in the lobby of the Women's Advocacy Center, watching volunteers prepare for our monthly support group meeting. The center occupies what used to be a small office building, transformed into a space where older women can find resources, legal assistance, and community when they're dealing with family members who abuse their trust and diminish their worth. We started with a grant from the state and donations from people who'd followed the story of my confrontation with Ethan. Word spread quickly through networks of women who'd experienced similar treatment, daughters-in-law who were slowly erased from family photographs, mothers whose opinions were dismissed as outdated, grandmothers who were tolerated rather than valued. The foundation operates on a simple principle: respect doesn't have an expiration date. Women don't become less valuable, less intelligent, or less worthy of consideration just because they've aged past some arbitrary marker of social relevance. And families that can't recognize that fundamental truth need to be confronted with the consequences of their cruelty. Today's support group includes Margaret, a 68-year-old grandmother whose son had been systematically isolating her from her grandchildren, Patricia, whose daughter-in-law had convinced her son that his mother's presence at family gatherings was too stressful for the children, and Elena, who discovered that her son had been forging her signature to access her bank accounts. These women come to us broken and isolated, convinced that they're the problem in situations where they're actually the victims. They leave with legal resources, emotional support, and most importantly, the understanding that they're not alone. How did you know? Margaret asks me during today's session. How did you know that fighting back was the right thing to do? I think about that question for a moment, watching these women who've spent years apologizing for existing, making themselves smaller and smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. I didn't know, I tell her honestly. I just knew that accepting cruelty wasn't protecting my relationship with my daughter, it was teaching her that cruelty was acceptable. And I couldn't do that anymore. Sarah has become one of our most effective volunteers, using her legal background to help women navigate divorce proceedings, estate planning, and financial fraud cases. She understands, in a way that many lawyers don't, what it feels like to have your autonomy slowly eroded by someone who claims to love you. Recovery isn't just about leaving bad relationships, she tells our support groups. It's about remembering who you were before someone convinced you that wasn't good enough. The irony isn't lost on me that the confrontation that nearly destroyed our relationship ultimately saved it. Sarah and I are closer now than we've been since she was a child, bonded by the shared understanding of what we almost lost and grateful for what we've managed to rebuild. She's dating again, carefully, deliberately, with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who's learned to recognize red flags before they become emergencies. She asks questions now that she never thought to ask before. She maintains friendships that her partner doesn't choose for her. She has boundaries that she didn't even know she needed. I like him, she told me about her current boyfriend, but I love myself more. And I'm never forgetting that again. Last month, we received a letter from Victoria Chin. She's finishing her graduate degree and has started a blog about financial fraud that's gained national attention. She's also engaged to someone she met in a support group for victims of financial crimes, someone who understands the particular kind of betrayal that comes with discovering that your entire relationship was built on stolen money and lies. I wanted to thank you again, she wrote, for showing me that speaking truth isn't cruel, even when it destroys someone's illusions. You saved me from wasting more years of my life on someone who saw me as an expense rather than a person. The employees who lost their pension funds have mostly been made whole through the asset seizure and restitution process, though the emotional damage of betrayal isn't something that can be repaid with a check. Several of them have become advocates for stronger oversight of retirement accounts, working to ensure that other workers don't experience the same devastating discovery that their futures had been gambled away without their knowledge. The Meridian Charitable Foundation has been dissolved, but 3 legitimate charities have been established to actually serve the populations that Ethan claimed to help. The children he used as props for his fraud now have real resources and real advocates working on their behalf. And Ethan himself? He's serving his sentence in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, where he'll remain for the next 14 years. I don't think about him often anymore, but when I do, I feel something that might be pity. He had everything: a successful business, a brilliant wife, respect in his community, and he threw it all away because he couldn't resist the urge to take what didn't belong to him. This afternoon, I'm driving past the building that used to house Ethan's penthouse. It's been sold to a tech company that's converted it into office space, and the marble floors that once echoed with cruel laughter now echo with the sounds of people building something legitimate, something that doesn't require victims to sustain itself. I don't slow down as I pass, don't feel the need to stare at the scene of that final confrontation. That building was never the real battlefield anyway. The real fight was for my daughter's soul, for my own dignity, for the principle that women, regardless of age, deserve to be treated with respect rather than tolerated as inconveniences. That fight was won the moment I decided to stop accepting cruelty as the price of maintaining relationships. Power, I've learned, isn't loud. It's not about dominating conversations or demanding attention or forcing people to acknowledge your importance. Real power is the calm voice that says enough and means it. It's the quiet strength that refuses to be diminished by someone else's need to feel superior. It's the woman who walks away from a penthouse party with her dignity intact while the man who tried to humiliate her watches his empire crumble in real time. Tonight, Sarah and I are having dinner at my house. Not because it's a special occasion, but because we enjoy each other's company. We'll sit in the kitchen where she learned to make cookies, surrounded by photographs of her father and memories of a family built on love rather than control. We'll talk about her work, my foundation, the books we're reading, the places we want to travel. We'll laugh about things that are actually funny, not because someone expects us to find cruelty amusing. We'll be ourselves, complicated, imperfect, wholly human women who don't need anyone's permission to exist. And if someone asks me about that night, about the moment when I destroyed a man's reputation in front of a room full of his peers, I'll tell them the truth. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Because some victories don't require ownership of anything except your own dignity. Walking away with that intact, while the person who tried to steal it faces the consequences of their choices, that's triumph enough. He said he'd rather kiss his dog than hug me. Now the world remembers my silence was louder than his laughter and more powerful than his cruelty could ever be. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't revenge at all. It's living well, loving freely, and never again apologizing for taking up space in a world that needs women who refuse to be erased. And that's a victory worth every moment of the fight it took to achieve it.